Hi all, Mark from Addax, and this is a knowledge sharing installment as part of the value add Addax provides our clients. In this session, Kim Hogan, one of Addax's payroll consultants, will explain how to properly process a payroll termination. Obviously aimed at those of you who have the HR suite, and in particular the payroll module. So let's begin.
Hi everyone, I'm here to take you through the HR Employee Termination screen. This screen is used to terminate an employee to ensure that all hours worked are paid, that any eligible termination payments are recorded correctly and taxed correctly, and that any accruals are accumulated and accrued correctly and paid out for termination. So let's get started. So the first thing is that HR has come to us and advised us that they have an employee that is terminating, and he has been given time in lieu of notice and he will not be working out his notice pay. They've also told us that he has worked 2 days this week on the 11th and 12th of May, and that he is to be paid out those hours, and the rest is up to us to complete in the termination. So we're going to pull up the employee and so what we are going to take note of is his pay rate. This person is on $23.15 an hour. We're also going to have a look at any of the outstanding balances. So you'll notice here that his annual leave is at 115 hours. He has sick leave, but that's not payable on termination in this instance. He hasn't been with the company long enough, and there's no pro rata long service leave due, and he has outstanding rostered days off. So they all need to, the annual leave and the rostered days off need to be paid out. Now we'll take note of his pay rate and those rostered days off, because unused RDOs and termination are an ETP, and we'll need to do some calculations further on in the process. We also note that he's a weekly paid person. So now we're going to go to terminate, and we're going to put in the reason he's terminating. They've said terminated. Different people will have different information there. Then we'll do that he's going to be inactive, and he terminated on the 12th of the 5th, 2020. Underneath, under comments, you can write anything in there that you think is reasonable in regards to the termination or in regards to the employee. And you can also put any outstanding items that are there that you want to have for reporting purposes. So we also note here it does have his age, and in there under Fair Work, you can, if you're over 45, you get an extra week of severance. So these are why these kind of dates are here, make it easy for you to be able to calculate. Also, again, it tells us his years of service, and so we know whether long service leave is due, etc. So next thing is that we click on this Create Final Pay. We put in a batch number. Now, in regards to this batch, you don't need to start a new batch for this person every time you terminate someone. If you have an open batch where you're currently doing normal pays, and this is the end of the process, and you want to do a termination pay for this gentleman, then you can add to that batch by just selecting the batch number here instead of starting a new one. Next, it brings up the Create Final Pay. We know he's weekly paid, and we're going to pay him for one period, and we're going to tax him over that. On Final Pay default lines, this person has only worked 2 days, and if we leave this ticked and he had a standard pay on there, it would bring in his 40 hours. We don't want that. We could delete it. There's no harm in leaving it on, but you just got to remember to take it out. I don't want to bring it in, so I'm going to take it off. Then include the standard deductions. I usually leave them on so you can make a decision, and I delete if I don't want them in there. Include standard employer costs. Again, I leave them on because superannuation is usually due on some part of the termination, and also some companies have payroll tax, etc. that I've got to calculate, and so I leave them there and take out whatever I don't need when I'm completing the pay. This next section, payout of unused leave. This is how the taxation on any unused leave is made. The decision is made in the system. So on a normal termination, it is set up to do a calculation in the background to ensure that the marginal tax calculation is done as per the ATO. To be able to do that, it uses a normal gross earnings, and how the system relates that is that on the pay transaction code, most people will have an accumulator. Some call it ordinary gross earnings, others will have normal gross earnings, but there will be an accumulator of some sort that you use to work out how the different things used to different items or pay items that are used to calculate their normal gross earnings. Then, if you're unsure, it is on your module control, and it will show you what accumulator you're using. And beside that information, you will find that it'll ask you whether you want to do it over a yearly time or on the last pay. It's not a problem if you don't. You can actually come in here and override it if you want to put in a different amount than that calculated by the system. This here, the normal tax, this is how the person has filled out their TFN and advised you that they want to pay their taxation. In this case, it's general exemption. You'll note that the next one is special termination. Now, this uses the concessional rate of tax, and you can have a number of them set up either at 17.5% or 32%, depending on what you're doing and where. But mainly it's the 32%, and the system will do those calculations, and it's usually on the bona fide redundancy amounts, etc. Because annual leave on redundancy is usually calculated at 32%. So we're going to do normal termination, and then we have ETP, so an eligible termination payment. So the two things that we discussed earlier was time in lieu of notice, and he had 3 weeks, and he had unused RDO of those 16.18 hours. So we're going to calculate those up into, and that has come to 2,778.31, and that has a tax of 32% of this amount. So the next thing to note is this bit here where it says tax-free component. This is not your lump sum D or your tax-free part of your bona fide redundancy. This is an eligible termination tax-free component, and that eligible termination tax-free component is actually in relation to invalidity, but you need to have a look in the ATO's website and it'll explain clearly on what those are, but definitely not your lump sum D. That turns up in another part of your payment summary and is not an ETP. The next part here is the ETA code. We will select that, and in this circumstance it's an O, and that's because we are getting a payment in lieu of notice and a payment of unused rostered days off. So then we'll click OK. Right, and this will bring you to the pay entry final pay screen. Go to the pay and you'll notice that his ETP for the 12th of the 5th has come in. Now we need to add his wages. So 11th of the 5th. He works an 8-hour day. We're going to give him his 2 days. So the next thing was deductions. And we double click on it and we're going to have a look at what it is, and it's his union fees. I pretty much are going to leave that there, leave his union fees up to date. It's $8. It's up to you. You can delete them out if you want to. The next tab here is your tax. So what you'll notice here is there are 2 lots of tax and a rounding calculation. CO2 is actually the calculation of his 2 days labour. The ETP is his 32% tax, and it's calculated separately because in the old days on an ETP statement we would have the ETP amount and the ETP tax on an ETP statement, and then all the other bits of his gross earnings and his tax payable against those gross earnings on his payment summary. Next is employer costs. So he has superannuation, it's at $35.19. Now that is only calculated on the employee's 2 days work. But under the SGC legislation, and if you're following that legislation, then unused RDOs and time off in lieu of notice is superannuation is payable. So there's really an extra hundred and something, an extra $299 of superannuation payable, and so we need to update that on top of this 35, which is 334. Now that will update his superannuation, and we've got that correct, and we'll click save. Now if you want to go back and have a look at it and have a look, this information is here at all times. And now we'll go in here and we'll go and look at his pay again now. So we'll look here and we'll notice that the ETP, his pay is there, and everything's saved. Right, so now we need to calculate his accruals. We go to the second button here and we'll calculate accruals. Now the system will do either time elapsed or hours accrued calculation according to the date that is here, and if it's a time elapsed it'll be according to this date, and it will do the number of days in the pay period and divide by. If it's on hours accrued, then it will use the hours within inside this final pay batch, which was 16 hours, and do the accrual appropriately. Payout balances. So we'll click payout balances and it tells us that the payout's done. So how to know that that payout's done? We'll just go to edit final pay, and you'll notice here now that on his pay tab that now we have that his annual leave has come in at normal termination, and here's 116. If you remember before, we only had 115 hours. It's done the accrual for these two days, added it here, and now it's paid it out. Nothing has changed on his deductions, but you'll notice on his tax now that we have changes. So what it's got is the $3 for his 2 days work, the ETP, and NT, which is his marginal tax rate on his annual leave on termination. And again, on his employer costs, it hasn't changed because superannuation isn't payable on termination annual leave. So we're happy with that. All the calculations are done. Now we can terminate our employee, and we say yes. So we can then go into opening the batch that we were in. And you'll note that it's exactly the same. You follow the whole process through on terminating an employee. Nothing's changed. It's got all the information that we put in, and everything's right to go. What you will go back to the employee's information. And you'll note that now on the balances, everything is zeroed out. Even though we did not do the rostered days off we did it through ETP, it's still zeroed out, and just like the annual leave, but it went through normal calculations. So the way that we can tell this information is if we go HR, system, payroll, transaction type, and pay. So annual leave 202. If we go to the balances here, remember how I said about the termination pay? This nominates here what will happen, what kind of taxation will happen when the person is on annual leave, and then special termination will have this information here. Now if I double click on here on this annual leave termination, you'll notice that it hasn't got anything there, and that it's going to this account. All it does is basically put it into a holding account so it knows to do that calculation. As I said before, if you're unsure about what accumulator for this on this instance on your module control, your normal gross earnings accumulator here was ordinary earnings, and we've done an average for the year. You can have last pay or the year, okay? And you'll notice that on each of these, it'll say whether it's included or not included in the ordinary earnings. That's just so everybody can know. And then on the RDO, HR, payroll, how that it zeroed it even though we had an ETP was 205. On the configuration, when we're doing the balances, we want it to zero when we terminate. See here, payout balances on termination, we want it to zero. So that's why we took note of it. We did the calculation, we put it in an ETP, and then the system zeroed out the amounts. If you wanted to see how much was owing to the person when they terminated, of course you can see here, it did the accrual, it did this, and it was all balanced up. Okay. So the next thing to take note of is when we're doing employees that have been terminated, I usually get quite a few phone calls in regards to the pay slips and that they won't print for the terminated employees. What you'll note is down here, include inactive employees. Because we press terminate, the employees become inactive. So if you tick that box, you will get a pay slip. You need to do that even if you're emailing as well, so that it knows to include those employees to email out. So if I don't have that ticked, this is the message you usually get. Okay. Other than that, I hope that you got everything that you needed on how to use the termination screen. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact Addax. Thank you. Bye.